Good day. I want to thank the Al Musna Cultural Network and Dr. Aid Kakun for inviting me to be part of the program today. And I look forward to the presentation of Professor Feinberg, who is a former colleague of mine. To begin, let me direct your attention to a picture. John Constable painted this picture in 1816. I grew up with it. My mother bought a copy from the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and mounted it over our fireplace. It portrays Wivenhoe Park, the estate of a rich Englishman about 100 kilometers from London. I admired the manicured lawns, the dramatic sky, and the play of light and shadows in the lawn and in the lake. An image of rural perfection. The picture is an idealized version of a kind of everyday life that was rapidly disappearing when it was painted. The same year that enormous increases in the price of bread led to the bread or blood food riots in East Anglia, about 100 kilometers away from Wivenhoe Park. This picture was painted in the French countryside 56 years later by Camille Pissarro. It also has sky, fields, and woods, but without idealization. The fields are not manicured perfection, just a place where people work as part of everyday life in the countryside. I do not suggest that idealization is always a bad thing. I think people often like it. It can even be an expression of hope, precisely because it is less than the truth about something ugly or unpleasant. In the 1960s, I was lucky to be able to teach photography to Black children in the Roxbury ghetto of Boston, Massachusetts. These young photographers did not like to take pictures in the neighborhoods where they lived because they were ugly and depressing. The students did want to photograph people. This turned out to be the most positive image of everyday life in their community. These pictures introduce some of the critical questions about representing, understanding, or changing everyday life. Specifically, do we want to know the truth about everyday life? Is the truth better than an idealized view? And if so, why? Whose everyday life do we want to know about? The rich, the famous, the powerful, or the rest of us, the masses? What theoretical tools do we have available to help understand everyday life? What can philosophy contribute to that understanding? I give a few tentative answers to these questions and will try to reach some conclusions about philosophy and everyday life. Contemporary life is life under capitalism, which now, in the age of globalization, has spread everywhere. Even the remaining socialist countries have all the essential features of capitalism: wages, markets, money, inequality, racism and sexism, lives of luxury for elites, and armies prepared for war. Thus, to understand everyday life, we must consider how capitalism molds that life. Saying this means that we're rejecting the atomistic approach of liberal political theory that sees society as the result of individual choices derived from a fixed human nature. It equally rejects so-called methodological individualism in sociology that takes individuals and not social groups as the primary social actors. People make their own history, but they do so in classes and only within existing social constraints. To understand this history, it is important to understand how people live their lives in classes. Most 20th century philosophers have ignored everyday life or had a pessimistic view of it. At one time, Lukács viewed everyday life as trivial. Heidegger saw it as standing in the way of humans realizing their possibilities. An exception to this pessimism was the French philosopher and sociologist Henri Lefebvre. Beginning in the 1940s and extending over 4 decades, he developed a concept of everyday life and how to critique it. That is, how to show that life could be and should be made better. Lefebvre saw everyday life as an organization of human life together with representations that disguise it, produced by the capitalist mode of production. He saw everyday life as something vital and creative, containing both cycles of repetition and motion in specific directions. Everyday life includes work, family life, and leisure, among other things. It has disruptions, but is not completely chaotic. Different sides of it influence each other. It is organized mainly by women, and those living this life typically do not understand their situation in Lefebvre's view. It is notable that Lefebvre thought that although workers and housewives are immersed in everyday life, people absorbed in technical specialties, statesmen, and so-called society women are not. These examples suggest that the rest of the capitalist class are not immersed in it either. Thus, if we accept Lefebvre's account, we will have answered the question of whose everyday life we want to understand, since it is mainly the working class that actually lives such a life. I will take Lefebvre's account as a starting place and suggest some changes that I think would bring the concept of everyday life more in touch with the realities of the 21st century life and life beyond Europe. To do this, I will make use of some specific ideas and positions from Marx, as Lefebvre did himself. Marx saw capitalism as an organic system of interconnected, mutually influencing, contradictory parts. It is a system with objective laws of motion, including those that lead to crisis that inevitably spread across the globe. The system has only limited ability to reduce or recover from mass misery that results from depressions, imperialist wars, and pandemics, and the negative effects of these crises on everyday life are profound. One idea I borrow from Marx is the power of money. In his youth, Marx wrote that having money is immensely powerful in that it can substitute for the capacity that the owner lacks, making an ugly person attractive and a crook appear honest. On the opposite side, it is obvious that lack of money prevents people from satisfying their needs, no matter what their strengths and virtues are. Money is also an aspect of systematic material domination. Marx wrote that, quote, "The heaped up wealth confronting the worker grows apace and confronts him as capital, as wealth that controls him. The world of wealth expands and faces him as an alien world dominating him, and as it does so, his subjective poverty, his need and dependence grows larger in proportion." Marx meant that money not only has the power to make an ugly person attractive, but in the form of capital, it subjects many people to a kind of slavery. A second idea that we should borrow is that social class pervades every aspect of everyday life. Marx argued that human nature is not entirely coded into human biology, but resides in the social relationships between people. These relationships differ in many ways over time and across social classes. Sociologists find that the speech patterns, friendship choices, religious participation, recreational activities, political attitudes, and many other parts of working class life differ a great deal from capitalist characteristics and activities. They also differ somewhat from the lives of farmers, shopkeepers, or academics, even when their incomes are not very different from workers' incomes. Class is more important than money as a determinant of everyday life. A third idea is that capitalism is an inherently exploitative system. Marx argued that the labor of workers in capitalist enterprises produces more new value than the workers are paid. The unpaid or surplus labor is appropriated by the capitalists and is the source of profit and of the interest and rent that is passed on to the bankers and landowners. This means that capitalist accumulation of wealth succeeds only to the extent that they can hold down the wages of workers. The attempt to do so is the main reason for capitalist globalization pursued by capital in search of low-wage labor, that is, a race to the bottom. Marx argued that the most fundamental internal contradiction of capitalism is that capitalism needs an unlimited expansion of capitalist wealth and forces of production, but it must restrict the mass of producers to bare necessities. The consequence of this analysis is that capitalism cannot possibly permit a future everyday life in which everybody lives a satisfying life and inequality disappears. Capitalists do not simply hold down the consumption of the masses, they control its content, a fact that has significant effect on everyday life. As Lefebvre puts it, the masters of production are also the masters of consumption. By dominating the media, they produce demand for what they wish to produce and to use it to extract more of the income of those who can afford more than the bare necessities. They do this, for example, by spending enormous sums creating a strong demand among urban youth for athletic shoes that sell for hundreds of dollars a pair. There is a general Marxist concept which incorporates many of the features of capitalism that affect everyday life, the concept of alienation. Marx borrowed this concept from the idealist philosopher Hegel. Roughly speaking, alienation means separation of what should not be separated. Hegel saw alienation in the capitalist society of his day as a practical and philosophical problem. He knew that many people did not see the economic and political institutions of capitalism as fundamentally good and did not feel at home in them. Instead, they were alienated, that is, they experienced painful social divisions like wars, poverty, hostility to the government, and breakup of families. Hegel saw this alienation as a phenomenon that could be ameliorated by philosophy by showing that these divisions have a rational basis or can be overcome by actions of the state. Marx took over the concept of alienation and showed that alienation of workers is actually built into capitalism. Under capitalism, workers are separated from the products they make and the wealth that results. Many workers, the actual producers of wealth, are separated from it and live in poverty. Their work makes capitalists richer and stronger and increases the domination of capital over labor. Quote, "The creative power of the worker's labor," Marx wrote, "establishes itself as the power of capital and confronts him as an alien power." This alien power routinely excludes workers from the planning and direction of their own work. Because of this, workers are kept apart from the creativity and self-expression that human needs and have to find outlets for creativity elsewhere if they can. Thus, labor under capitalism is always a kind of slave labor. Workers work to pay the bills, not to express their own capacities, values, or talents. The power of money is an alienation phenomenon. Money is an alienated ability of mankind, Marx wrote, is a product of the labor of people who are separated from the results of that labor. Racism is also a kind of alienation, a separation of human groups that should not be separated. Alienation pervades capitalism, but to understand everyday life and its future prospects, we must go beyond the abstract label and examine alienation in everyday life more concretely. Let us try to do this with racism. Using the term racism very broadly to include all kinds of ethnic conflict, xenophobia, and religious bigotry, like Islamophobia, it is clear that racism in these various forms has a profound effect on everyday life in most countries. Anti-foreigner movements have become strong in Europe and the US, among others. Antagonism toward and discrimination against Muslims persists particularly in the US, the UK, Europe, Myanmar, and India. Public persecution of Muslims in India occurs alongside similar actions against Dalits and others at the bottom end of the Hindu caste system. Large militant protests in the US against the racist police murders of George Floyd and other Afro-Americans has found strong echoes in other places where the masses experience police violence and see the movement's slogans I can't breathe and Black Lives Matter as referring to their own lives. Marx took racism, broadly construed, to be fundamental to the capitalism of his time. By the 1870s, he had already identified promoting ethnic conflict as a critical strategy for preserving the rule of the British capitalist class. Every industrial and commercial center in England, he wrote, now possesses a working class divided into two hostile camps, English proletarians and Irish proletarians. This antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling classes. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class, despite its organization. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and that class is fully aware of it. The capitalist class of every country is able to guarantee that divide and conquer ideologies achieve a dominant place because of their domination over the economy and the state. The class which is the ruling material force of society, Marx wrote, is at the same time the ruling intellectual force. Ideological dominance is not optional for the capitalist rule. It is part of the nature of capitalism that capitalists can only be a small percentage of the population. Capitalists know very well that their system could not exist if the working class that it exploits were to unite against it. Each competing group of capitalists must try to make sure that workers do not unite against them, and also to try to get some support from some sections of the masses by getting them to see capitalist society as divided up in some fundamental way that cuts across class lines. Beyond mere division, a racial or ethnic social hierarchy tends to make the division of society into social classes seem more necessary or legitimate, building racial inequality into people's understanding of social class and their everyday lives inside the class hierarchy. It would be a mistake, however, to see the living effects of racism only in the divisions it creates. This would mean ignoring the systematic material oppression of minority groups that racism involves. This oppression, enforced by state violence, typically includes low wages, unemployment, miserable living conditions, poor health and education, etc. These conditions benefit capitalists directly by lowering the labor costs that they have to pay. The enforcement of this inequality by the state is particularly clear in the pattern of police murders in the United States and the state-condoned anti-Muslim and anti-Dalit violence in India. Even the subjective lived experience of racism is strongly affected by material conditions imposed on specific ethnic groups. In the United States, for example, Black adults are 20% more likely than white adults to report serious psychological distress. Black adults and children are more likely to experience feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and worthlessness than white peers. Black adults living below the government's official poverty line are 2 to 3 times more likely to report serious psychological distress than those living above this line. Thus, it is a mistake to try to understand racism as arising only from racist interaction between individuals without looking at the material oppression inside capitalism. This mistake is characteristic of theories of racism that derive from traditional European idealism, which defends the idea that I can acquire the status of a free, self-conscious being, that is, a subject, only if I am recognized as such by some other subject. Anti-Black racism is represented in this framework as a persistent failure of whites to recognize Blacks as subjects. This approach concealed the causes of racism within capitalism, an ideological framework that arose as part of the trade in African slaves and still serves as a bulwark of capitalism. Ending racism and its effects means eliminating its material basis, which is the global capitalist system that benefits from the divisions that racism creates and the material oppression that it represents. The movement to eliminate capitalism and achieve an everyday life full of freedom and creativity for the masses without oppression and misery, if successful, necessarily will result in a massive improvement of everyday life. In particular, it would mean that millions would no longer live under the threat of police murder. Although I believe that Lefebvre has contributed significantly to the understanding of daily life, I think that it is important to overcome some shortcomings in his work to make it applicable to the 21st century reality. Much of Lefebvre's work is focused on everyday life in Europe, but in the era of globalized capitalism, that perspective is far too narrow. A more international perspective is needed, and the effects of racial oppression on everyday life need serious study and elaboration. Lefebvre's use of gender roles in everyday life is certainly out of date if they ever were correct. It is no longer true that factory workers are nearly all male, and their wives prefer to be homemakers rather than factory workers. Worldwide, the labor force participation rate of women is nearly 50%, and over 50% in the OECD countries. Many of these jobs are in factories, especially in industries like ready-made garments. Women are often the majority of factory workers in export zones, maquiladoras, in low-wage countries. Even though more women work outside the home than in the past, women are still the main organizers of everyday life and spend many more hours in unpaid work in the home than men do. Let me end with brief answers to some of the questions I posed earlier. I have assumed that we want to know the truth about everyday life. Whether the truth is better than an idealization depends on whether or not there's a path forward to a better life. It is my conviction that such a future is possible. If it were not, however, we might prefer to be comforted by an idealized view of reality. I think that Marxism is at the center of the best theoretical tools for understanding everyday life and its improvement. To continue to play that role, however, Marxism must continue to advance, casting off old errors and developing new perspectives. I think that the outstanding error of Marxists in recent times is the idea that socialism will lead to communism, the classless society. Lefebvre also repeatedly expressed his reservations about socialism. I think that it is possible to figure out why socialism does not lead to communism, which seems to be the verdict of history. The capitalist features of socialism allow a new privileged ruling class to grow up within it, a class that does not want to do away with its privileges, but preserve them. Sometimes they do this by dumping socialism entirely, as in Russia and Eastern Europe. Sometimes they have socialism with billionaires, as they do in China. The result is never communism or anything close to it. As Marx said, theories must prove their truth and power in practice, and the theory that socialism leads to communism has failed that test. I don't think this means that communism cannot come to be, however. Class societies first originated about 12,000 years ago. For most of our 200,000 or so years on this planet, our species has lived without social classes in societies more like communism than capitalism. I think communism will yet prove to be the best way for human beings to live and provide the best everyday life. In order to move in that direction, however, capitalism must be defeated by a mass movement of people dissatisfied with their lives. To create such a movement, it is important to have a true understanding of everyday life as it is now, a view that is not idealized, but shows the actual endurance and vitality of people in everyday life. This is something that Camille Pissarro did in many of his pictures of everyday life of his time. Here is one of those pictures. Thank you for your attention.